Hello and welcome back to an Infinity the Game tournament recap. This is round 3 of Anzac Cup. We have just played round 2 after having a bye in round 1. We are playing Starmada. Round 3 is the beginning of day 2, which as I record has just happened, and I'm going to be playing Clighly Hassified, which is a player variant of Highly Classified, against Hassassin Baram. So as a reminder, this is the list that I would be playing. It is built around a Zeta Lieutenant and 2 3-man fire teams, each consisting of a Psychop, a Kappa, and a Raven Eye, 2 Roadblock Paramedics with Okos, 2 Varangians, a Lambda Engineer, and a Warcore. This is the list my opponent would be playing. I believe the list choices are correct, but the groups I can't exactly remember. This is probably broadly accurate. I think it was 1 Rafik in each group, so this is probably about right. Hassassin Baram in this scenario was potentially a worst case scenario. Hassassin Baram are very good, and although I have some means of defending against Hassassin for days, they're still very scary. I'm going to have to reserve the Zeta so that it doesn't get jumped, and I have all of these 3-man light infantry single wound link teams, which are very vulnerable to Fidei shotguns. Not only that, I'm going to be kind of zoned out of picking Test Run as a classified, which you would think like Hassassin Baram may or may not be able to do. It might be a challenge for them or it might be easy. It depends how they build for it. This list has built to be able to do Test Run, but I have 1 engineer and I cannot risk a Fidei jumping that engineer, particularly not if I'm not going first. And as it happened in this case, whip 14 versus 13, I wouldn't win an LT roll the entire event. So I'm going second against Hassassin Baram. My opponent thinks about it, but like they go first. Because you do. You're playing Hassassin Baram. The list is comprised of a 5-man Gulam link. So we've got a missile launcher for ARO, an NCO because it's excellent. We have an Asawira hanging around here somewhere. Asawira Lieutenant, AP Spitfire, with no chain of command. So that's going to be relevant. We have the missile launcher, the NCO, and then we have 2 Hassassin Barids. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces. It isn't going to be a pure core, but it is going to be a high utility, high impact core. Then we have an unlinked Boktar FTO paramedic with tactical awareness. An excellent piece, and I think a piece that I would actually have made the lieutenant under the circumstances. You do have a Gulam NCO, but it would have given flexibility in how these pieces can be played, although as it happened, given how the Boktar's first turn went, probably for the best it wasn't the LT. We then have Al-Jabel. Al-Jabel is not a piece I would typically kind of ever actually play if I have not already taken 2 Hassassin for days, but we are playing Highly Classified variant here, and he allows you to, on the first order, do net undermine. And that was going to be one of my opponent's plans, so I get the point in that case. We also have a Farzan Forward Observer, 2 Rafik remotes and an engineer to kind of unlock Test Run, 2 Dalamis, which are very good, 1 for Noose, and then a Gulam Doctor. I've listed, there should be a Nazmat around here, and I believe it was the Doctor, the Doctor that had the Nazmat. Now, we're going to stop and think now about how the classified pick went, because it was an interesting decision. We've rolled, knowing who is going first. My opponent is going first. Personally, I would much rather if it was the usual means of picking classifieds, which you pick your list afterwards, then you roll for initiative. But there was player feedback, and again, I could do a whole video on how this version of Highly Classified is an example of how players design things, but that's a separate matter. And so my opponent won the initiative roll, and so makes me pick classifieds first. I'm not sure why I kind of have that disadvantage, but it is strictly a disadvantage to pick classifieds first. There's no advantage to it. Kind of weird, but it is what it is. So I pick paramedic the HVT inoculation, and very rightly my opponent says, tell me you have a paramedic roadbot without telling me. Now I have 2 paramedic roadbots. This is a classified that is very easy for me to do, and it's not bad for my opponent to do. They do have this Boktar FTO, which is a pretty great piece at doing it, but it's going to be easier for me than for my opponent. This is going to be a 50-point piece that my opponent would have to extend forward, and although a Boktar is reasonably fast, it's not roadbot fast. So I am way better equipped for doing that classified. My opponent then picks Net Undermine, and I breathe kind of a sigh of relief that I have picked my list with 2 Psychops, not just 1, so I have 2 veterans. Starmada have a bunch of veterans, but they are a bit unevenly spread, and in the list that I was playing, Psychops were the only one. So, okay, Net Undermine, tell me you have Jabel without telling me you have Al-Jabel. I then pick Nano Espionage, which, if you recall, is the get into base contact with an enemy with a paramedic or doctor, paramedic, or engineer and make a whip roll. Now, as classifieds go, this one was errated in the most recent ITS season to not require you to be in the engaged state with an enemy. So you can do it on unconscious enemies, but again, it's a really hard one to do unless, for example, you have paramedic a paramedic 9/6 move models with glue guns, in which case it's actually surprisingly doable. So again, it's a classified that is going to be not easy for me, but doable for me and hard for my opponent. And then finally, my opponent picks Predator. Now, picking Predator is always a risk because it's very feast or famine as far as classifieds go. My opponent also doesn't have any more melee than I do. He's got Aljabel and an Asawira. That is 100% of the melee in his list. And I've got 2 Varangian guards, but also plenty of capacity to knock models unconscious and then step on their neck. So that's kind of a high risk play, but I think he figured, you know what, it's going to favor. If he gets a good run with Jabel, he could just do that on the first turn as well. In terms of private classifieds, one of the advantages as well of me choosing to put down nano espionage in particular is that it means that it's on the table and I can't draw it. I can't draw nano espionage because we both have to deal with nano espionage. So I get to choose between, and I think my choices were HVT espionage and test run. And test run, I mentioned I'm a bit wary of picking that as one of the 4 because what it means is that my engineer gets immediately decapitated. But as a private classified, I feel like it is possibly worth the risk. So I pick test run as my private classified. So as noted, my opponent has won the roll and has elected to go first, and this is how his deployment has gone. This is the table that we're playing on. You may recognize it from the How Do You Set Up a Table video, and I've set it up in a pretty similar configuration. Broadly basically the same. In response to feedback I got after the event, I actually might cut this piece of acrylic out to create a line there, but otherwise I'm relatively happy with how it played. Now, one thing to note is that we are treating this topper as part of the table, but these buildings are not. So I have deployed my HVT here, but let's just go through my opponent's stuff first. So there's a flash pulse remote hanging out way at the back there. The doctor is hanging out back here, and my opponent's HVT is in behind this acrylic. Very difficult to reach, but again, I have 9/6 move climbing plus roadbots. The Bokta has deployed here. There is, I think this is the Doctor back here actually, and then there are, basically here is where the bulk of my opponent's force is. The entire 5-man link is in this space, as are the 2 Rafiqs, and the engineer is hanging out back there. So all of my opponent's force is kind of here, except for one Dalami that is there, another Dalami that is here, and the Hassassin Farzan that is there. I actually assumed this would be chain of command at this point, but it's ended up to be the forward observer. That's totally fine. For my part, how I have deployed is basically let's try not to get shotgunned too badly by Fidays. So we are splitting across elevations a lot. We also have the Varangians pulled way back. So there's one there and there's one there, and then the mines are further forward. So the approaches to the deployment zone are a little bit blocked off by mines, and then anything that, like, if a Fiday hard YOLOs into like this spot here, it's at least going to have to split its shotgun in different directions. So we've got one of the fire teams is the Warcore is here, then there's a Psychop there, a Raven Eye there, and a Kappa Hacker there. So again, kind of like spread out, not easy for a Fiday to get all of them at once. And then over here we have a Raven Eye, another Psychop there, and another Kappa Hacker there. So again, spread out, not easy for a Fiday to get all at once, and there's the Chain Rifle Varangian back here. We then have the first Roadbot Oko duo here, so there's a Roadbot there and an Oko there, and this Oko is very important, as is this one. Between the 2 of them, they basically are spreading a hacking area that kind of like overlaps there, and neatly and completely covers my HVT. So we have the Gavin Bateman low value target hanging out in this position there. And I have left, like, it does mean that there's really no hacking coverage down here, and hacking coverage here is coming from the hacker directly, which is more vulnerable, but it means that this thing is going to be really hard to get to. We then have Aljabel pop down there, and okay, look, that's fine. If he's going to come around this way, he can potentially kill some things, but this is a tolerable position. But I don't want the Zeta anywhere near him. The biggest risk I have is that my BTS-6 Zeta gets completely got by Aljabel, or gets completely got by the Asawira Spitfire. So the Zeta just deploys in a completely safe location where it is not going to be any danger, and my plan is to just ride out my opponent's first turn and see what happens. So my opponent is going first, and in terms of combat groups, it actually turns out that Alja Bell is in the second combat group, and there's a 9-6 split. So mostly just as a, I'm not really sure where the biggest threat is, cowardly compromise, I take orders from both combat groups, one order from each combat group. And so my opponent goes into his first turn, and yeah, the first thing that happens is Alja Bell reveals out of impersonation state, but just hangs out there, and does, in one order, does net undermine. I'm totally okay with that. Please spend an order doing that. You don't have that many orders left in your group. Just chill the frig out there and don't do anything else. So he actually ends up doing that, and I think he just he's going to do something else this turn, but we'll come back to that. Otherwise, what we have is, to be a little unfairly critical of my opponent, he makes a strategic error, which is he tries to do slightly too many things at once, and we'll sort of walk through both of them. The first combat group is going to have 11 orders down to 9 because there's attack aware on the practically important pieces. Like, he's got a lot of orders because he's got 3 attack aware and an NCO, so he's packing 19 orders just like me. But the Rafiks are not quite the same as Oko's escorting roadbots. So the big play, and I think it's a really good play, is that this link leaves the missile launcher behind and moves up and over here. And the Bereaved Killer Hacker from this position here puts down 2 repeaters, neat as you like, there and there, hits both of them, and then the link begins to pull back. But what it does first is it spotlights this Oko. And that gets my opponent 1 classified. It gets him his private classified, which was telemetry. And then he begins to move the Boktar forward. And this, I feel, was the mistake, because the Boktar has attack aware order, which it should have used. It basically should have used attack aware order to position itself. There's a nice little nook here or here. Spend maybe 2 orders, get to that position, and then chill out, right? Just end up there, because there are other things that needed to be done. Instead, the Boktar moves all the way forward, and it has to like long jump up to here to have a run to do paramedic the HVT. But this jump exposes it to 2 oblivions, and it gets isolated. Then it tries to reset, and it gets carbonated. So now it is literally sitting here trying to like, it's just completely rooted. He stops there. My opponent recognizes don't throw more good money after bad. But this situation with these 2 repeaters needed to be unpicked a lot more than it had been. This was much too aggressive. And it also cost multiple orders. And the attack aware is fine, but then there was a movement, and then there was another movement, and then there was a reset. So that's 2 to 3 orders more than my opponent needed to spend. And what he should have done instead is continued to pull this link back, hacking as he went. He had a repeater here and here, and this Roadbot Oko duo is very susceptible to soft kill. If you can isolate and immobilize both of these pieces, I do have an engineer here, but she'd have to like move, climb, repair, which would have been best case scenario 4 orders from that second combat group, all the while under repeater coverage, getting spotlit, etc. as I went. If that's particularly relevant, there is no missile bot. But more importantly, each time that was doing, this link could have been moving and hacking, moving and hacking, moving and hacking. Instead, it basically had like 2 orders maybe to move, and that meant that it ended its turn spread out in this position here. Now, my opponent did reform, so it brought the missile launcher back into the link, but we had a standing Asawira here, a completely in the open NCO here, and a standing Barid, something like this. And that was real bad. The Rafiks just used their tactical awareness orders to move forward. This one actually, I think, just moved up to this position here, and then this one would move forward to there onto this ramp. And that was basically my opponent's turn. And it was an example of trying to do slightly too much. Oh, sorry, last thing, in terms of this combat group here, Aljabel would peek out, discover, shoot this mine to death, actually get, I think he moved far enough forward that he would get targeted when he was doing this, but that would not matter at all, and then he would move back to here and impersonate. And that is functionally almost all he would do for the entire game. So what my opponent has tried to do is go heavily after all of the classifieds, which means I've taken 0 casualties. I haven't even realistically been hacked particularly much. And so because of that, I'm heading into my turn with 19 orders. I am going to have more realistic goals in terms of classifieds that I can do, but I'm going to try and kick the absolute bejesus out of my opponent. And so once again, we have a game where the first turn is going to be heavily revolving around the Zeta going Burt. However, the first thing that we do is that this Psychop moves around to here, and it takes, I think, 2 orders, and it shoots the Boktar to death. The Psychop is an MSV shooter firing armor-piercing rounds. The Boktar is a heavy infantry with mimetism, but this is an ideal gunfight. I'm going to end up in about this position here, and 2 orders later, her trying to reset on 2s, she goes all the way to dead. Or she goes unconscious, and I will shoot her later in the turn, which I should not have done, by the way, but that is what it is. That takes about 2 orders, which means we have something like, if we want it, I want to say 12 orders to spend, 10 orders to spend on the Zeta. And so it's going to spend something like 10 orders. Its path will bring it up and around here. It's going to discover, it's going to get a actually it's going to move up and over the top. It's going to be faster because of how good Clubbing Plus is now. It basically moves over here in 1 order, sees this Dalami. Dalami doesn't respond. I discover it. I shoot the Dalami, and then I just discover it on the end of the first order. So that's tack aware. Then Lieutenant is going to come around here and down to there. Dalami only sees me in cover. Shoot the Dalami to death. We then move up this way and into this nook here. And you can't necessarily see it, but there's a nice path underneath this tower into this space here. And the Zeta will spend most of the rest of the turn moving in and around that space. And what it's going to do is it's going to kill this Dalami. The Dalami will actually end up taking a Panzerfaust shot at it from out of cover as it's moving around here, but it's crap range for a Panzerfaust, and I have it out of cover as well. So this Dalami goes down, and we are going to kill this Gulam NCO, this Gulam missile launcher, this Asawira to unconscious and it will fail its regen roll, and this Rafik. And if that sounds like a cripplingly horrifying first turn to suffer, you are correct. The Zeta has accounted for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pieces and put my opponent in loss of lieutenant. And this would not have happened if my opponent had been just a bit more conservative, hadn't overextended the Boktar, and had pulled the Link team further back. I think I would still be in a fine position, but I would be in a fine position rather than a catastrophically dominant one. So my opponent goes into his second turn, and actually let's just jump ahead here. We can also kind of see some of the movement that has happened. So if we can see that the Roadbot Oko duo has moved to there, and that's literally just tack aware, so the Roadbot's going to be hanging out something like here. We can see where the Zeta has ended up. The Zeta has taken exactly 1 wound over the course of this turn, which I have repaired, which has given me test run, and then stuff is sort of just beginning to move forward. So at this point, I think I only have 1 classified, but I have done test run. And I have done test run. That's the most important one to get done, but my opponent is in loss of lieutenant. We've had a Varangian that's moved up here to put these 2 repeaters down. And the Varangian is going to be, I want to say, the sole casualty of this game. I might at some point also lose the Roadbot, but I don't think I do. So Jabel's going to peek out to see this Varangian, just to do something. My opponent is in that kind of like thought trap where he's in loss of lieutenant and he's already spent a whole bunch of command tokens turning like Dalami orders regular. He must do a thing. So Jabel moves out, and Jabel will in fact double shotgun and kill this Varangian, but he will get knocked unconscious by the chain rifle in response. And then there are more face-to-face rolls here. And these face-to-face rolls are things like the Rafik moves out to fight the Zeta. And that's just a bad time. I think we end up in situations here. So the Doctor's going to move around here. The Rafik moves out to fight the Zeta, and I think it gets knocked unconscious by the reactive shot. But even if it doesn't, it's ballistic skill. It's damage 13 against a tag. Like, there's just no way. You could maybe you quadruple crit, but like, it's just not a good fight. And this stuff, the engineer and the killer hacker Hassassin Barid, just get pinned back there. I don't know who my opponent has made his lieutenant, but it doesn't really matter because I have the absolute run of the board the next turn. What we end up doing is there's a few things basically, but it's classified turn in my second turn. I have 18 orders to spend this turn, which is still going to be comfortably ample. So there are 3 main lines of play. The first one is that this fire team is going to move up and around to here, and around through this way. I think the Farzan has come forward as well, so the Psychop will shoot the Farzan to death. Again, that's a very comfortable face-to-face roll. We think we discover shoot, so the Farzan's going to... No, it loses the face-to-face roll, and it drops prone. So it's going to drop prone down to there. And this team's going to move up through here. And what it's trying to do is get across the halfway line, and I think it takes 2 or 3 rip rolls, but the Psychop does net undermine. So I've done my test run already, and then that's another classified, and then this roadbot team is going to move around here, and the roadbot will come up and actually it'll come up and around this way, and it will cop a shotgun from the doctor, but it will goop the doctor in response. It will then move into and do paramedic the HVT, so that's another classified. Then it will move into base contact with the doctor and do nano espionage, that's another classified. And this takes a few orders, but not that many. Like, the doctor is desperately trying to dodge, but it's not really in it. Like, it's trying to dodge on fours. So I've got test run and then 1, 2, 3 classifieds. So all that's left is predator. And to do predator is not that difficult. The warcore is going to run around here and step on Al Jabel's neck. And then the Zeta runs around here and steps on this Rafiq's neck. So that does predator as well. There is a bit more like back and forth and seeing what's going on, but actually with this Rafiq down, and particularly with Al Jabel down as well, my opponent begins his final turn in retreat. The game ends, I believe, in the retreat state, but I have done literally every classified, and my opponent has done, I want to say 2. I think he's done telemetry, and he did one other. I'll have mentioned it, I forget what it is. So that's going to be a 10-4 win to me, and basically a 10-4 win in 2 turns. And a lot of that was off the back of the fact that there was a really clean mobility kill that my opponent could have had with this repeater on these two, this duo here, and that would have put me in a situation where, like, my choices were a lot more difficult, getting test run on him would have been more difficult, isolated models aren't contributing orders, etc. Even this Varangian moving up here to put down the repeaters would have been much more challenging if these 2 pieces had been isolated, because they all share a combat group. So some very, like, nuanced play mistakes, and not mistakes, but like try to pursue too many lines at once. When in this, as in many scenarios, you need to really balance the damage you do to your opponent with the progress you make in the scenario. And if you do all progress on the scenario, you put yourself at risk of being counterattacked really, really viciously. And if you go all attack, you put yourself at risk of falling behind. So there is a real balancing act to be had. And I think my opponent was off it in this game by, like, literally by 2 orders, right? All it needed to be was the Bokta, or 3 orders. The Bokta needed to not make this run. And if the Bokta doesn't make this run, everything that happens with the Link team is better. With a couple more orders and a couple more hacking attacks, this duo is basically potentially nullified, and all of this stuff here gets back into better positions. And so the Asawiri doesn't die, and if the Asawiri doesn't die, there's no loss of lieutenant. Like, so you see the knock-on effects, basically. So I think the game was ultimately, it was not very close, but it had the potential to be really close. It was a really interesting, really good game. It was really interesting to face down, like, the Hassassin for days. I think in this scenario, there is a very viable Hassassin build that's just like, I am going to kill all of your specialists with my 2 for days on the first turn. That wasn't what happened in this case. My opponent played the mission. The eye on the prize, like the eye on accomplishing the mission objectives, was really, really good. Just the balance was not quite right. So in any case, that ends round 3. The second game I have played, because I had a bye in the first round. And so this is going to be another 10-point win. So I'm now on basically 3 wins, 2 good wins and a bye, and we're heading into the finals in round 4. That's coming up soon. Stay tuned.